All right. Hello, Andre. This is Brian Raya with the final assignment for the physics class. Very briefly, I'll go through this very quickly. I'll go through the checklist very quickly just to give you a brief summary of everything that was completed and what wasn't. In terms of the number of levels, I have the 3 levels, that being level 1-1, level 1-9, and a really bare bones Ferris wheel level where all it has is a Ferris wheel. I didn't really have that much time to iron the Ferris wheel level out and make it look pretty. But that should be the 3. I do have the ability to switch, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. I don't have the ability to turn on and off debug sprites. As I mentioned, with keys 1, 2, and 3, you're able to click. I don't have a bird queue, so this option is not available. The slingshot, this is the previous one. I'll show off the more modernized one in a bit, but it does have click to drag in the newer version. As I said, this is the older version, so as you can see on the screen, it's based on the pull of the string. So if I pull back, you can see my bird fly. And 1 second, I'll reset this just to show that this bird also has the explosion. You can see the explosion area right here. And my bird rolls on the ground. That's something I would like to note for right now because when I ported over code to the newer version, it didn't necessarily work. But anyways, that was the midterm deliverable, and I'll show off the full completed one in just a minute. In terms of the number of birds, you already saw the blackbird with its explosion. I have the red bird right here, the default red bird. There is also the yellow bird, but you already know about that since you've used it multiple times in class. It's basically lifted from there. I can show it, but as I said, you already know that one in great detail from what you've given us. I don't have the blue, the yellow, big red, or the green bird. I ran out of time for implementing all the other birds. In terms of blocks, I think this level shows it the best. I have stones, I have wood, and I have glass. In terms of pigs, I only have the regular normal pigs without helmets. I'll go into detail about everything else. As I mentioned, I don't have a queue, but I do have a sling. This sling, as you see on screen right now, has the ability so that if I click and pull back, you can see the trail highlight. If I let go, it will follow that path and it will hit. As I mentioned, the weird thing that happens with this one is that my pigs roll as in the midterm one, but when I port it over code, my birds no longer roll. So if I press space, I can reload back in and I can pull this back. I can pull it back so I can try and hit the other one. As you can see, I follow the trajectory, but for some reason, my bird just bounces back and forth. I think you are also able to see that blocks do tend to get damaged. Oh, I don't know why I closed it. So I can show off as this one, you see it took damage and disappeared, so did the glass. I haven't dealt enough damage to break everything else, but the pigs also disappear when being dealt enough damage. As I mentioned before, pressing 1, 2, or 3 will switch between the two. So if I try and boom, you can see that I deal damage to those objects, and they just tend to break when enough damage is dealt to them. I may have missed a few of the whoops, but you can see right there, there's some damage. The pigs are there, and there's my weird non-rolling. But I'll get back into that in a second. You can press 1, 2, or 3 to switch again. I don't have the cue, but I'll briefly go into the code to show off where I was headed in the direction of things. So for the background, I just have a background to overlay the sprite, and I have this background assistant which creates a ground so that way the user, or that way the bird doesn't fall through the ground. In terms of the birds themselves, I have an abstract bird, which is what all other subbirds inherit from. So that way I can call kill trail on all of them, activate special move for those that have it, to get the special state, to know if that bird is pointing, and whether or not to turn on and off the trail. In terms of the blackbird, nothing really special. You'll see that all of them are circles, but for some reason they don't roll. Like I said, in the midterm deliverable, it worked, but not now. His density is 25, but if I go into the red bird, the default, his is 20, and the yellow bird, since he's faster, will have a speed, or have a density of 15. They also have max damages. They for the ones that have special abilities, like the blackbird, like I shown in the video, the blackbird has activate special move for the explosion. The yellow bird has its punch through value, right here, punch damage. But like I said, you've basically given us a lot of what this stuff is. At the end, I'll demonstrate the yellow bird just to show that it's been done. In terms of the blocks, we have our ice blocks, which have a lower density since, well, I assume that they're glass, not ice, but glass would have a lot lighter, would be a lot lighter of a material compared to the wood. The wood, if I just pick any one of them, is about 10. And stone, being extremely thick, has a density of 30. I have a whole bunch of different types. So I have long blocks, mid blocks, thick blocks, small blocks for ice, for stone. I only have the long ones because those are the only ones that appear in level 1.1 through 1.9. I also have the all the ones for wood, and I do have a generic block that you've given us to make life a little bit simpler. The smarter thing to do now that I learned was to just use a generic block, so that way to have a single collidable type, and that would be a generic block against abstract bird. So that way I wouldn't have to write out all the collision types. But at this point, I was too far in to make this work. It's something that as I was programming and building mock-ups from the very beginning, I made all of these things. And by the time I got around to remembering this, I just forgot about it. But that would have benefited me for the contact listener. The Ferris wheel, it's very simple. All it is we give it a position in space, and it generates the pigs and the pedestals and causes the main motor to turn around and around. It also has a call that's called mark, which will mark everything for deletion when the time comes to swap to the next level. We have the gear, which is the center point for the Ferris wheel. I didn't connect each one of the pedestals to the center of the Ferris wheel like you wanted. But moving on, here is some of the jump commands. Nothing special. They're both here, but they weren't implemented. The idea was to have them in queue be able to jump, and the pigs, I don't know why. I don't think the pigs jump. But the idea was there. In terms of the levels, again, all I do is I've created levels, so it's easier to create a brand new level. Level 1-1, these are all the blocks that are used. I save all of the pointers, so that way when it comes time to terminate, I mark everything for deletion, and then on the subsequent frame, I delete everything. The same occurs for 1-9, everything was set. And then when everything was like in the proper position, I just set everything to active. But this is the entire list of things. Terminate works in the same way. There's a whole bunch of lists that contain all of these pointers, and when it comes time to terminate the scene, we mark everything for deletion and again delete. In terms of the custom only has the Ferris wheel, so I have the Ferris wheel. I mark the Ferris wheel for termination and I delete it. I created this abstract class, which is level abstract, and that's just what I use to make it simpler to switch between level 1, 2, and 3, and I'll show that off a little bit more in a bit. I have particles, as you've seen before. One of my ideas was to put a fountain in the middle of the Ferris wheel level. That might hit the player's birds, but that didn't happen. The pigs, as I mentioned, I only have the normal default pig, and as I mentioned, that's really weird. I have a box 2D circle, and I also have that on my blackbird and my redbird, but none of them roll, even though I'm using the same calculation. I'm using the arctangent to arctan2 function, but as you can see, they're both circles, and they have the exact same information in terms of this, but my birds no longer roll as they did before. Something must have happened when I ported this over to like newer versions of this engine, but I don't know what happened. Here's all the collidable stuff for the pig. This is a pain, but as I mentioned, it would have been so much easier if from early on I just had one generic type and all the derived types, and then I could just simplify these calls as I did with all this like abstract bird and abstract or generic block. But I forgot. Moving further on, you've already seen the rest of my like ropes and things like that from previous assignments. I didn't add them in here, but I could have cheaply put them in here just to make life simple. In terms of my sling is broken up into basically 3 parts, which is the smaller handle, the little tiny handle, my big handle, and the entire sling altogether, which by accident I called it test sling. But when I call slingshot right here from test sling, it will just basically add the little piece, the big piece, and the string. It will hold this information. So I have the anchor point, so the point from which the elastic pulls from, and a few other additional things. AB entity was given to us, the stack also given to us. The contact manager, I've shown how things get called. My recycling pool down here, you can see things being recycled and deleted. The audio manager is here for plain simple sounds, but I don't have them on or even implemented, I think. My contact action, as I mentioned, I had a red bird against every object, a yellow bird against every object, a black bird against every object, small pigs against blocks, explosions against blocks, and all these other things. But as I mentioned, this got out of hand very, very quickly, that eventually I figured there had to be a simpler way, and I was messing around the idea of just having everything be called through the abstract bird and having the abstract bird have virtual calls to, all the derived birds, but I just didn't have time. There's the sling. That was the contact action. My explosion gets called when things happen. I use, as I mentioned before, I use the quarry of an area, and I basically apply a force that radiates from the center outwards. You mentioned not to use this in particular, but I also didn't like the way that Ed basically argued for his way. And the sensors did make sense, but I ran shortly out of time to fully implement that system. For the input test, as I mentioned, I created abstract bird as a way of allowing me to do a mouse test on all different types of birds. I didn't have to rewrite this 20 million times for each bird. But I first check if the thing that I'm testing against, or testing to see if I'm clicking, is null or not. If I did set up the queue system, that would mean when the bird flies, I don't test, and the rubber band wouldn't track the bird as it's rolling around. But again, the queue system wasn't implemented. In terms of the slingshot, you get the anchor point, you give it a max length, and with a little bit of math, you calculate the midpoint of the new string, you calculate the length of the sprite, and you also calculate the angle. So that way it always appears to do the nice pull effect. The bird, when you're inside the bird and you're holding the left click, we save the previous state of that, so that way as we're holding and pulling around and moving around, the string follows the position of the bird. And when we end up letting go, that means there's been a switch between the previous state and the current state, and we just launch the bird out by applying an impulse to it. We also have the ability that if the bird is flying and we give the nice right click, you can do the explosion like you saw with the blackbird, or activate the special if that call has been overloaded by this virtual function. Sorry, overridden, not overloaded. Let's see. That was that information. I also had the really nifty raycast quarry. Something that I might have wanted to mess with if I had time is it's a pain in the ass to go into a level and move each one of the blocks individually. I could have just raycasted. I could have just used this raycast to highlight a block and then have the keys up, down, left, and right assign the position of it, and I could have just printed out the positional values after I've moved the block, written them all down, and made my life a lot easier instead of typing in an answer, compiling, loading. But yeah, good planning always comes when it's too late, Andre. I made this nifty little enum to help me very quickly create static and dynamic bodies. I don't really use that anymore, but it's there. In terms of the main level.cpp, I have all my objects there, I have my layers, and in terms of creating the sprite, everything is there. We start off at level 9. Oh, actually, I should show how I switch between levels. If I go into the key states, basically all I do is if I am currently pressing key 1, I check to see first if I'm pending a scene change. I'm not, or hypothetically, I won't be. So if if the scene change is not the same scene, because we don't want to reload the same one as you wanted, you said we would press R and we would just reload our queue of things. But we first terminate the scene. We set this state to pending. We come back on the next frame. Everything's through deferred removal gets removed on the next frame. Again, this happens almost instantaneously because how fast it happens. But I'm still holding. I switch the scene. I create a new level 1, and I set the state. The terminate basically takes all the objects, all the pointers that are held by level 1 1. So in this case, this stuff and the list of blocks of the different types. And we just iterate through those things and we mark them for deletion on the previous one, and then we clear them out when the actual object gets deleted. But that's how we switch between levels 1, 2, and 3. And that's how that occurs. Oh, I should show yellow bird. Yellow bird. But in general, that that was a majority of the things that were done. There's yellow bird. Again, even though it's a circle, he doesn't roll, which I don't like. But you can quickly switch between levels, as I've shown. That basically covers everything that I've done. Like I said, Andre, I'm missing a good amount of things, and I understand in terms of like where my grade stands. Other than that, thank you very much. Yeah.